Hi there, welcome back. St. Thomas Aquinas for everyone. I'm Dave Palmer, and we are now in an extremely important part of the Summa where we are going to be talking about three important concepts that really it's all about salvation, right? And that's grace, justification, and merit. And St. Thomas's treatment on this, and this is extremely important because when the Church Fathers gathered in the 16th century, for Trent, they were using St. Thomas Aquinas's treatment on salvation, justification, which of course was the big issue, and that's what Martin Luther was arguing about, in order to formulate and explain the Catholic Church's teaching on these very important topics. And as you can see, we're going to have 4 videos. This one's going to be kind of long because we're going to talk about grace and eventually justification and merit and how it all ties together, okay? Extremely important information, and I hope and pray that I can do it justice. Obviously, with as big as the Summa is, I can't cover everything, but I think I found the articles that are most important on these particular concepts. All right, so let's get into it. And when you think of grace, word association, what do you think of? I do this with my high school students, and I say, what do you think of when you think of the word grace? And oftentimes people will think of grace before meals, right? We say grace, bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts which we're about to receive. You might think about that famous song called Amazing Grace, one of the most popular church hymns, one of the most popular songs in all of Christian history. It's a pretty catchy song. Or maybe you think of just God's grace and what exactly that means. One of the definitions of it is a participation in the life of God. Okay, remember we've talked so much about nature and how we, being humans, are actually called to be lifted above our nature, and that's what grace has to do with. Grace perfects nature, right? You've heard that saying perhaps. And then one kind of random one, if you're older than me, you probably recognize this lady, Grace Kelly. She was, I'm sorry, Princess Grace. Princess Grace was very popular back in the old days, and she was like the Princess of Monaco or something like that. So maybe you know somebody named Grace. All right, so all right, let's move on to it. There's 5 different articles that we're going to cover here, and again, I think these are important questions having to do with grace. What is it necessary for? What does it mean? What do we need it for? That kind of thing, right? And so now we are at the very end of the first part of the second part of the Summa, which means that we're getting to the midpoint of the entire Summa, because once you get into Prima Secunda, you're pretty much halfway through the Summa. So we're almost at the half point, if you're keeping track of all this. Okay, whether without grace man can know any truth. Okay, can you know anything without grace? Can you know facts about math or science or what have you? Interesting question, right? And there's a little graphic. It has to do with knowledge, has to do with epistemology, right? And Thomas says every form bestowed on created things by God has power for a determined act, which it can bring about in proportion to its own proper endowment. This is an important concept. God gives each of us a nature, which means that we can, by our very nature, do certain things, right? A bird can fly, and a snake can hiss and crawl, and a pig can snort, and we can reason, right? Okay, and beyond which it is powerless. Pigs can't fly, snakes can't dance, right? Except by a superadded form, as water can only heat when heated by the fire. And thus the human understanding has a form, intelligible light, which of itself is sufficient for knowing certain intelligible things, for example, those we can come to know through the senses. All right, we can come to know things. I'll give you one example, kind of a random example here in a moment. We can come to know the periodic table of elements. We can come to know mathematical formulas or chemistry, what have you, people's names. All right. Higher intelligible things of the human intellect cannot know unless it be perfected by a stronger light. For example, the light of faith or prophecy, which is called the light of grace, inasmuch as it is added to nature. Okay, we've talked about this before, and I'll give you another example here in just a moment. But first, hence, we must say that for the knowledge of any truth whatsoever, man needs divine help, that the intellect may be moved by God to its act. Okay, we can't do anything without God assisting us, okay? If God was not pouring his grace upon me right now, I'd be dead, okay? Because we need God's assistance to breathe our next breath, right? But what exactly? But I also have a nature that allows me to think and reason and sense and smell and taste and run and laugh, right? So that's what we're talking about here. But he does not need a new light added to his natural light in order to know the truth in all things, but only in some that surpass his natural knowledge. Okay, so there are certain things that we'll be talking about in future videos that allow us to do things that exceed our knowledge, exceed our abilities, like to heal or to prophesy or to speak in tongues. Okay, we can't do that in our nature, but through grace we can. All right, so here's a random picture. Okay, what is this? All right, you're going to say it's a toad. Okay, the fact that you know that this is a toad, and I bet some of you said frog, right? It's not a frog, it's a toad. And here's some more specific. Okay, that's the scientific name. Now that you know this, Thomas is saying that to some degree you needed grace just to be able to have the capacity to know, but you didn't need a super added grace to know that, because it's in our nature to come to know things. We can come to know what a toad is, and even its scientific name, okay? I know that's very random. All right, Article 2, whether man can wish or do any good without grace. All right, here's a picture of a guy, I think I showed you this before, carrying another runner across the finish line, okay? He's doing an act of goodness. There's some people helping the homeless, or parents raising a child, to be godly. And then here's Adam and Eve. And Thomas is going to make a distinction here between Adam and Eve before the fall and us after the fall. And can we do any good, okay? Man's nature may be looked at in two ways. First, in its integrity, as it was in our first parents before sin. Okay, this is Adam and Eve before the sin. Secondly, as it is corrupted in us after the sin of our first parent. Okay, something changed after original sin. We feel the effects of original sin because of Adam and Eve sinning, right? Now, in both states, human nature needs the help of God as first mover to do or wish any good whatsoever. But in the state of integrity, as regards the sufficiency of the operative power, man by his natural endowments could wish and do the good proportionate to his nature, such as the good of acquired virtue, but not surpassing good, as the good of infused virtue. Okay, so Adam and Eve needed supernatural help to have faith, hope, and charity, just like we do. Okay, those are infused virtues. But in the state of corrupt nature, man falls short of what he could do by his nature, so that he is unable to fulfill it by his own natural powers. Okay, so what's the difference between Adam and Eve before the fall and after the fall? Okay, they had wounded natures, they had corrupted natures after the fall, but not before. We have corrupted natures now. We're wounded, okay? And yet, because human nature is not altogether corrupted by sin, so as to be shorn of every natural good, even in the state of corrupted nature, it can, by virtue of its natural endowments, work some particular good, as to build dwellings or plant vineyards and the like. Yet it cannot do all the good natural to it, so as to fall short in nothing, just as to a sick man can of himself make some movements, yet he cannot be perfectly moved with the movements of one in health, unless by the help of medicine he be cured. Okay, this is really interesting, because this gets down to what happened when Adam and Eve sinned. What happened to our nature? Okay, we still had human nature just like they did, but we have now are wounded, and we have a proclivity to sin. We need more grace in order to just carry out the basic functions of goodness, right? Here's an example of Catholic teaching, okay? We are still good. We are still good in our essence, but we're wounded, like this man here has a wounded leg, right? Martin Luther introduced the whole concept of we're dung covered by snow, okay? That just means that we are corrupted and pretty awful people after the fall, after sin, but Jesus just puts a layer of snow on top of us, because through Jesus' death on the cross, we are made righteous. That's a very fundamental difference in the way that some Protestants and Catholics see the human person. This is important to understand. very, very different between Martin Luther and the Catholic Church. And of course, Martin would have been aware of Thomas's teaching, and he probably would have agreed with it. Okay, whether man can merit everlasting life without grace. You can probably imagine he's going to say, no, he sure can't. There's a picture of everlasting life, okay, the beatitude of heaven, which we all aspire to. Acts conducing to an end must be proportionate to the end, but no act exceeds the proportion of its active principle, and hence we see in natural things that nothing can, by its operation, bring about an effect which exceeds its active force. Okay, toads can't fly, pigs can't fly, like I said, snakes can't dance, crickets can't talk, and there's certain things we can't do by our nature. We can't achieve our end without a supernatural lifting up beyond our nature, right? Okay, now everlasting life is an end exceeding the proportion of human nature. We learned that in the first question of the Summa. Remember that? Hence man, by its natural endowments, cannot produce meritorious works proportionate to everlasting life, and for this a higher force is needed, the force of grace. We have to have grace. And thus, without grace, man cannot merit everlasting life, yet he can perform works conducing to a good which is natural to man, as to toil in the fields, to drink, to eat, and to have friends. It's really, really important that we understand our nature. It's really important that we understand how we're different from dogs and goldfish and angels and porcupines. And this is something that I think is missing in our culture, in our world right now, is an understanding of the human person, a human anthropology. And Thomas gets it so good, right? Remember the dog and the chemical formulas and the chemistry? A dog will never be able to understand chemistry because it's not in its nature to be able to understand chemistry. If God decided to give a dog some super added grace to understand chemistry, he could. That's what happens in the movies and the cartoons, is we see talking animals all the time. It's like they're lifted above their nature, right? And that's what Hollywood does. Okay, whether man by himself and without the external aid of grace can prepare himself for grace. Okay, we prepare, for trips and for study, and we prepare food. Okay, we're always preparing things. Well, can we prepare ourselves for grace? Can we do something in order to make ourselves able to receive grace? Isn't that an interesting question? Since God is the first mover, simply it is by his motion that everything seeks to be likened by God in its own way. Hence Dionysius said that God turns to all to himself, but he directs righteous men to himself as to a special end which they seek and to which they wish to cling, according to Psalm 72, "It is good for me to adhere to my God." And that they are turned to God can only spring from God having turned them. Now, to prepare oneself for grace, as it were, to be turned to God, is to be turned to God. Hence it is clear that man cannot prepare himself to receive the light of grace except by the gratuitous help of God moving him inwardly. Okay, so we can't even prepare ourselves for grace. God is in control. We are at God's mercy. But how does this fit in with free will? That's an interesting question, right? If we can't even prepare ourselves, we can't really do much. How does free will play into it? That'll continue to be a theme as we go through the Summa. Okay, whether man without grace can avoid sin. All right, so here's some sin like rioters and gluttony and abortion, laziness, gossip, or hatred, whatever this picture is representing. Thomas says we may speak of man in two ways. First, in the state of perfect nature, Adam and Eve. Secondly, in a state of corrupted nature, us. Now, in the state of perfect nature, man without habitual grace could avoid sinning either mortally or venially, since to sin is nothing else than to stray from what is according to our nature. And in the state of perfect nature, man could avoid this. Okay, that's what Adam and Eve had. Nevertheless, they could not have done it without God's help to uphold him in good, since if this had been withdrawn, even his nature would have fallen back into nothingness. But in the state of corrupt nature, man needs grace to heal his nature in order that he may entirely abstain from sin. And in the present life, this healing is wrought in the mind, the carnal appetite not yet being restored. That's why we have temptations to gluttony and lust and avarice and covetousness and greed and all this stuff, because we're wounded, we're corrupted. Okay, Adam and Eve had it a lot better. Obviously, they could still sin because they did, but their nature was more intact. Their nature was clearer. Okay, there's Adam and Eve, and there's us. Okay, wounded nature, perfect nature, but then that's what they lost through sin. All right, hope you enjoy that. This is the first of 4 videos about grace, justification, merit, and number 2 will be forthcoming in the next day or 2. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for liking and subscribing and passing this along to your friends. And let's get a conversation going, okay? These are very, very important topics in the Summa. In fact, it could be argued that these are the most important because it directly has to do with our eternal salvation. God bless you, and thank you for watching.